And it's lights, cameras, action. Well executed, I'm the main attraction. Engaging vibes is where I wanna be. Enchanting lights and smiles is all you see. So I ain't thinking about the next one. Snapping pics, they be loving my fashion. Great drinks, great friends, and it's flowing well. It's the perfect event. Shout out Riel.
Y'all have found the right place. Y'all look amazing. Thank you for joining us. We just had a great conversation with Five talking about how they're feeling about this election. So we're really excited to talk to you all. As you can imagine, policing has come up quite a bit today and defunding the police and all of that, abolishing the police, different forms. So I'm going to hop off the screen. I will push WC, help him join us, but feel free to start introducing the topic and each other and all of that.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, we'll dive right in. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Tamar Davis. I am a staff reporter at PRISM, where I cover criminal justice, and I'll be moderating this discussion today about police reform and abolition and what all of that could look like. As Gabrielle mentioned, obviously this summer, this whole year has been a lot of conversations about policing, about public safety, about alternatives, about abolition, and all these different ways to address these like social harm. For a lot of people, it's been a space where people are learning about policing for the first time or engaging with it in a way that they hadn't before. So I think coming up on this incredibly important election, it's great to always bring this to the fore and make sure it doesn't recede to the background. So I'm joined by two panelists, and one is on the way. Alex Joseph, Ashley Payne, and W.C. Johnson will be joining us as well. Alex is former state and federal prosecutor, and her current work seeks to dismantle the criminal justice system by educating Georgia voters about criminal justice reforms in the state. Ashley Payne is an attorney who previously served as a prosecutor in Georgia, and since 2018, she has been engaged in nonprofit work that I'll let her kind of expound upon in just a bit. And W, who will be joining us in just a moment, is the chair of Communities United for Change, which is a Louisiana-based organization advocating around police reform. WC is also the executive producer and host of Our Story Network television program. So my initial question, I kind of would just jump right into the conversation, is if you all could just state your position on police reform and abolition and why and how you've come to that place. And as you're introducing yourself, if you could just reiterate your name, your preferred pronouns, and share a little bit of background about your work, that would be great as well. And my pronouns are she, her. So maybe we can start with Alex.
We can start with Ashley, but my name is Alex Joseph, and I go by she and her. And I founded Informed Georgians for Justice, which is an organization, and I don't even like to say it's an organization, it's a project to educate Georgia voters about sheriff and DA, district attorney elections in our state. Because people always like to talk about the big banner elections, president, senators, but it's the sheriffs, it's the district attorneys that are impacting so much of daily life in your state and in your community. And the fact I always like to lead with is 1 in 13 adults in Georgia are under some sort of supervision within the criminal justice system. So 1 in 13 adults in Georgia. So that means that 1 in 13 adults in Georgia are on parole, probation, in prison, or in a local jail. And it's just an astronomically high number. And hearing that number, I shouldn't have to convince you that the criminal justice system is just so hugely important. And you asked, what is our position on police, defunding the police? And really, I don't even like to center the police in the conversation. I think a lot of the conversation is about defund the police, get rid of the police. And really what I think we need to be talking about, and I like to talk about it this way because I think it's more positive, is we need to reinvest in our communities, because we cannot talk about policing because policing is the end of a system where so many things have failed. We have to talk about investing in schools, investing in communities, investing in mental health resources. And hopefully we can create a world where policing isn't necessary or policing is a last resort, A, but B, I understand why people are afraid of snap your fingers and get rid of all police. And so I think that we don't want to make people afraid of that community, of that world, and instead talking about reinvesting different community resources, I think is a way to bring people to the conversation. And I also think it's a realistic solution to this problem. So I certainly want to shrink the police force in this country. And I think that police absolutely need to be a last resort. And I also think that it's very telling that the three panelists are from the South, because policing in America started as people enforcing slavery. And so the very origins of policing in America are incredibly racist. And so we can never invest in police and make policing something better than it is now. Instead, we just have to consistently shrink what police are. So that's my take.
Thank you. I'll kick it over to Ashley.
So again, my name is Ashley. My pronouns are she and her. I am from Georgia, and I came to the work of understanding police through both working as a prosecutor and being a loved one of siblings who have both previously been incarcerated, one in prison and one in jail. And my stance is unequivocally about defunding and abolishing the police. I believe that we can live in a world free from police, and that we can have a world that's safer for its inhabitants, particularly its Black inhabitants, by having a world without policing. And what that means for me is not just abolishing police, but that means abolishing all systems of actually policing. So that means, social workers who feel deputized to act as police. That means teachers who feel deputized to act as police, neighborhood watchmen who act as an arm of law enforcement, abolishing prosecutors. Prosecution is antithetical to justice, so I believe in abolishing prosecutors as well. But any system that we currently have that acts not only as an extension of law enforcement, but engages in the work of policing, I feel like that we are capable and that we can, and it is achievable that we abolish those systems. And we must, if we intend to have a country that is going to be more equitable for its most vulnerable citizens.
Thank you. And so you both kind of touched upon something that I wanted to move the conversation into, which is the idea of like abolishing policing and not just law enforcement as you might see it outside or, on the news. And I wanted to know if you can elaborate on that just a bit about how all these other systems are connected to police. And in that answer, if you could also speak about public safety and how we define public safety and what alternatives can help ensure it in the ways that it's not being ensured right now. And maybe I can start with Ashley.
When we think about policing is the way in which we surveil and we monitor activities in the way in which we engage with one another. And so that is not limited to law enforcement. So think of a person who is going to apply for Section 8 housing, and that person is drug tested. That act of drug testing is a function of policing. Or a person who is, engaged with child protective services, if they are drug tested, that drug testing again is a function of policing. And so you have multiple social services that are engaging in the work of policing in terms of meting out what's supposed to be help. And instead, what has happened is that they feel sort of deputized to act as an extension of law enforcement. So let's say you're trying to get your Section 8 housing, you get drug tested, and now you can't get housing. And that also cuts you off from other benefits. Let's say food stamps, and now you can't get access to food stamps. So those are all mechanisms by which we police behavior. And it is an extension of law enforcement. And in terms of thinking about public safety, we have to think about, and with abolition, Dr. Ruth Gilmore Wilson says there's a fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves. And it is, what are the conditions that make us vulnerable to harm? So what gets us in this position that we are vulnerable to either harming each other or harming ourselves, or at risk of being harmed by the system? So we know that a person who is hungry is at risk of being harmed. We know that a person who doesn't have a home to go to at night is at risk of being harmed. Children are at risk of being harmed. Women, trans women, people who are disabled, all of those identities make us vulnerable to being harmed. So to answer the question of public safety and how we keep each other safe without police, we get to the root of those things that make us vulnerable. Well, if everyone has access to clean and safe and stable housing, that's one way that you've removed their vulnerability to being harmed. If everyone has access to an adequate education so that they cannot be exploited in the job force and the job market, that's a way that you've removed their ability to be harmed. If people have the right to make a decent living, if they have access to a universal basic income, for example, for people who are disabled and cannot be asked to work in order that they may live a dignified life. Again, that's another way in which you make sure that they have an ability to remove that opportunity for harm. And that's sort of the way that we start to think about public safety. It's what can we do for one another in community so that we are less likely to harm each other and harm ourselves.
I think that, not to completely just copy everything that Ashley said, but I think what her answer really addresses is their society's main problem with policing, which is again why I don't even like to center the conversation about policing, because the entire court system, and by court system or criminal justice system, it's so much bigger than we imagine, right? It's the court system, it's prosecutors, it's public defenders, it's probation officers, but it's also child protective services, it's juvenile justice. All of those systems are designed really to punish people. And we as a society cannot envision a world in which our government just helps people, just gives them things, doesn't drug test them, doesn't decide what's a good parent or a bad parent. And so the problem with the criminal justice system that I think very few people understand, but Ashley and I are former prosecutors and we've seen it, is it's flypaper. And so once you get stuck in it one way, it is impossible to get out. And so we really need to shrink or eradicate the system and not work to reform it. And also, you asked about public safety, and we as a country have to stop thinking about policing in terms of public safety. Policing has nothing to do with public safety. And we know that because the vast majority of people's interactions with cops happens during either traffic accidents, not even like a traffic collision, but you pull over by the side of the road, your tire goes out. So in cars, that's the vast majority of people's interactions with police officers. And then also, and if you come away from this panel with anything, this is so important, and I know that WC is joining us, but we have made so many things illegal in America that have nothing to do with public safety. So I think the first
I think we just lost Alex momentarily.
I can expound on that. The things in terms of what we made illegal, for example, traffic offenses. That is something that you can find yourself on probation for, running a stop sign, for a speeding ticket. And while there are certainly public interest in making sure that it's safe to drive on the roads and that we all are able to get to our destination in one piece, we have to ask ourselves, where is our society when you can run a stop sign, and now you're on probation for a year, or, you have to do community service, or you have to go to jail, because you ran a stop sign, or because you were speeding, or because you failed to yield. So the fact that traffic accidents can actually land you in criminal court is a testament to where our system has sort of devolved. And I think that was the point that Alex is making in terms of the things that we have now criminalized. If you rent furniture from errands or rooms to go and you don't make your payment, you can find yourself in criminal court. That is a criminal offense now, instead of what should be a contract dispute between two parties. That's actually something that could, again, land you in jail or in probation for things like that we've sort of just criminalized. We've used the criminal justice system as a catch-all to sort of address any issues, any interpersonal issues that we have one another. We are now using the criminal justice system as the catch-all to eradicate those things.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, we're having a little bit of technical glitches, but Alex actually kind of just was speaking about
I heard her. That was effortless. We planned that.
and it's so interesting to hear you both kind of speak about, I think what you're getting to, like the idea that crime is socially constructed in a lot of ways and has been used to redress like social harms that have nothing to do with like, you know, the things that we
by calling people criminals, we stop caring about them. And we have to stop doing that. You know, a person accused of a crime is just a person that's incarcerated is just a person in prison is just a person. And somehow, once we call them a criminal, we don't want to give them help. We don't want to let them live in housing. We don't let them to see their kids. And we have to stop doing that.
And I mean, I would love when WC hops on to get his take on this as well. But I think what you both are speaking of is this idea of a society where people's basic needs are being met. And that, you know, a part of abolition is not just dismantling policing, but it's, you know, putting into place these new systems, these new ways of living. I think for a lot of people, there seems to be, or understandably, there's a question about like, how do we actually get to that space? And it seems as if defunding has been lifted up as almost a bridge from where we have what we have now and what we're working towards. Can either or both of you speak to defunding as a strategy? You know, what does it actually look like on a local level? Maybe you can both speak to, like, you know, Georgia. And then what ends does it aim to work towards?
More specifically, instead of Georgia, I think Chicago is an excellent example in the fight for defunding. So Chicago, Rahm Emanuel was proposing a $95 million cop academy in Chicago, and lots of young activists on the ground have been pushing back against the cop academy. Chicago already spends $1.8 billion on policing. And at the same time, in 2013, closed over 50 public schools. So when we talk about defunding, we talk about rerouting the money that we are using for a cop academy or $5 billion on policing and putting that back into keeping public schools open, making sure, because the safest place for kids in Chicago is a fully funded school. That's an opportunity for you to get an education, to get a meal, to get social services connected with whatever other needs you may have, if there are mental health needs, if there are healthcare needs, fully funding public schools. And so rerouting that money from policing and actually putting it into funding things like public schools, funding community organizations like Project NIA or Survived and Punished or Black and Pink. That is a way, the goal is to, for me, in my understanding, is by removing the money from the police and reinvesting it, as Alex said, directly into the community, into community organizations. What you are doing is getting to the root of what people understand to be the causes of the reason that we sort of need police. So the idea is that we need police is because they keep us safe. You know, if we don't have police, what happens if, you know, someone breaks into my house? What happens if, you know, someone gets shot? What happens if someone's in the store stealing? Well, the data has consistently showed us that if we take money and invest in our communities, take that money that we would spend on policing, because here's the thing, police cannot predict crime. No matter how good they are, they cannot predict crime. They are merely reacting every single time. So if they are merely reacting, they don't predict crime, and the data shows that they have not actually reduced crime, then we know what does reduce crime. We know what can predict crime. Hunger predicts crime. Not having access to a job with a livable wage predicts crime. or what we're calling crime, what we are, or what people are participating in, not having a safe and stable housing, not having access to healthcare. So we are reinvesting that money into community orgs that work with making sure that people have access to their medications, making sure people can get to their doctor's appointments, making sure people can get transportation to their job, that they have a job that pays them a living wage so that they can actually afford to living in safe housing that's free of mold, that's free of environmental issues, like that's not next to landfill so that there are breathing issues. All of those things, we know when we reinvest money, we reinvest into making sure that our planet is not dying on us. That also benefits making our world safer. All of those things help make us safer. And if we take that money from law enforcement and actually put it towards people and services that help us commit less harm, then that's how we get there. That's how we are able to get from defunding to abolition.
I second everything Ashley says, and I will say that I have two approaches to the defunding question. So the first thing is, I think that you can zealously, vehemently believe that there need to be less cops, that we need to defund cops, all of those things. But I actually also think at the same time that we need to vote and be conscientious about who we're voting for. So a quarter, 25% of law enforcement officers in this country work for sheriffs, and we directly vote for sheriffs. And so you should know who your local sheriff is, and you should make sure that your sheriff shares as many of your beliefs as possible. So your sheriff should not encourage solitary confinement in his or her jail. Your sheriff should not cooperate with ICE. So in the fight to defund the police, I still think that voting for city council members who hire police chiefs, voting for sheriffs, voting for district attorneys that share your ideals, it's not counterintuitive. As far as the fight to have less police, to get rid of a police, to eradicate police, I have been pretty discouraged by the world lately. So I get very, very discouraged about the defund the police thing. But I think one of the smallest steps that we can do, the number one predictor that you're going to end up in the adult system is interaction with the criminal justice system as a juvenile. And we know that Black children in America are over-policed. And that is because, in part, we are putting real police officers inside of schools. And so one of the small things I want to do, so not even talking about on the city level, the county level, the state level, is if you are a parent that's listening to this, or you're a voter, you need to make sure that your local schools do not have real police officers. And I actually really like talking about this because a lot of old people are really afraid of defunding police, like really, really old people, because they get scared. And I actually love having the conversation with them about police in schools, because I say to them, well, did you have police in schools when you went to school? And the truth is, they didn't even have like security officers. They had nothing. And you know what? Their schools were fine. And then if anybody brings up, school shootings, you can point out that officer at the Parkland shooting, did not prevent that shooting. In fact, ran from the school. So I think we have to get real officers out of schools. And I know that's not really addressing your point, but I think Ashley did a great job of painting like the big picture. Look at Chicago, look at the examples. But if you want to make like an impact in your community on the micro level, I think a really great first step is getting real cops out of schools, because that school to prison pipeline is real and it's not going away, and it is feeding the system, and it's creating clients for the prison industrial complex for generations to come. So if we can stop that now, I think that we can actually change the system going forward.
Thank you for that. I think on the local elections and the local elected officials, that's something I want to definitely circle back to towards the end of our conversation. And the piece around school resource officers and school police is incredibly vital. And I think it speaks to like the omnipresence of police and institutions that people aren't even fully aware of. Like I go to the grocery store, you can see a police officer, and it just speaks to their ubiquity. So you both spoke to making sure that there are systems in place for people to have the things that they need, because we know how harm occurs. I think one thing that I definitely hear when I speak to people in my reporting is that there is still an acknowledgement that like even in the best circumstances, like violence could still happen. I wanted to know, as you know, folks who are proponents of the shrinking of police power, how do you envision alternatives that still effectively address harm when it does happen, and what does that look like?
Sure. So obviously, Black women are in a precarious position because we are at extreme risk of being killed by our intimate partners. We face the highest numbers of intimate partner violence, and Black trans women even more so. And if you look at that, it's interesting because the question comes up of, well, if we get rid of police, who's going to keep Black women safe who are facing these harms with intimate partner violence? Who's going to keep Black trans women safe? And it's who's keeping them safe now. You know, we already have the numbers. We are already being disproportionately killed by our partners. There's so much information around what happens when Black women file protective orders or when they go to court to try and seek recourse through the court systems and through law enforcement, and are repeatedly ignored or not heard, or the remedies don't go far enough. And so in thinking about what are real things that we can do, because I think this is where a lot of people get concerned about abolition. It's like, okay, make it real for me, because this whole idea that like, it sounds great, it seems so fluffy and so frou-frou and so utopian, but how is this real? Well, it's real in that we have to build community support. And what does that mean? That means figuring out who are the people in your immediate community, whether they are family members, whether they are friends, whether they are people you know and people that you organize with, where you come up, what's a safety plan that you have in the event that this happens? What are the mechanisms for accountability? Do you have people in your community who know how to hold accountability sessions with one another? If not, there are resources out there. Miriam Kaba is an excellent resource, and she's at Prison Culture on Twitter, in hosting and co-collaborating with lots of organizers who put together so many materials that teaches each of us. So in a YMCA that's in your community, in a Boys and Girls Club that's in your community, in a fitness center or whatever, where you can come together and learn how to host accountability sessions. And what you do is, in that space, you talk about what happens when we harm one another. What do we need to be whole? How do we be whole, and how do we move on from here in a way that doesn't involve law enforcement? And in that, you speak about real strategies and real things that you would need to make you feel safe. And it's something that you come up with your own community, so that you have your own solutions. And that's sort of where we go with where we are now and how we get to abolition, and thinking about how do we keep Black women safe? Well, Black women aren't safe now from police. Like, we face being killed by police, and we face being killed by our intimate partners if we don't call the police. So there has to be something different. And that something different can look like building community structures where we come together and talk about, here are our safety plans, here are accountabilities. It talks about cishet men getting together with other cishet men and them learning how to intervene when men are perpetuating violence with one another. And so it looks like each of us actually stepping in and taking responsibility for the people in our community.
I think I have two thoughts. That we have to separate harm from violence. So the system as it exists now, it does not care about actual harm, and it does not care about actual violence. So as far as actual harm, white collar criminals steal more. Actually, people lying on their taxes steal more than every bank robber in America combined any year. But you are going to find bank robbers or armed robbers getting much longer sentences and actually being prosecuted, whereas people that lie on their taxes, the IRS treats that as a misunderstanding, and you discuss it, you get a lawyer, and no one's going to jail. So, I mean, the system doesn't care about actual harm. It doesn't care about harm when it's in terms of violence, but it also doesn't care about harm in terms of dollars. And then in terms of violence, the system doesn't care about violence. And we know that because little girls or teenagers are taught in self-defense classes, when a stranger grabs you, you need to do this, you need to do this. Well, that's not the reality. It is intimate partner violence, it's domestic violence, it's family violence. And we are very uncomfortable talking about those topics. And I also, before I heard Ashley's answer, was going to talk about domestic violence. We do not care about domestic violence in America, and domestic violence is the #1 crime that involves violence in this country. So we have to, when you are discussing police reform or abolition or anything with anyone, and they say, well, what about violent crimes? The response immediately has to be, the current system doesn't care about victims of violence, 1. And 2, like 2% of what police officers actually do, if you look at the average police agency, is investigate violent crimes. The vast majority of what police officers do is respond to traffic complaints, noise complaints, disorderly conduct. They protect property. And so pretending that the current system cares about harm and harm reduction or cares about violence is just a fallacy. It's a false start.
Tamar, if I may add also, I neglected to mention a few other steps. Things like making sure that we have less access to guns. We know that women who are experiencing intimate partner violence or domestic violence, if there's a gun in the house, they're 700% more likely to be killed. So making sure that there's less access to guns. It comes back again to that question of what makes us vulnerable. If a woman is in a situation or a person is in a situation where they are being harmed by their partner, and they feel like because the housing market is so inaccessible, they have to stay with this person who's harming them because they don't have housing. Many heard this summer about the tragic story of Oluwatoyin Salau and how the condition that she was in was she was experiencing homelessness. And because she was in that particular position, that made her vulnerable to a predator whereby he could harm her because he provided housing. And so it goes back to, if we are meeting these basic needs, if a person understands that staying in this relationship won't be life or death because I'll be able to have a home without them. I'll be able to have access to housing. I'll be able to provide for my children without them. I know they don't have access to a weapon, so I feel safe being able to travel to another place. My job won't necessarily discriminate against me because I've experienced this. If we put those things in place, then we make people less vulnerable and more empowered. Having access, this is something that also people don't like to talk about. What happens to people who are committing harm. Those folks need interventions as well. Having access to therapy. Therapy is something that is still wildly inaccessible in this country in terms of a therapist. If you are fortunate to have insurance, your insurance may not cover that particular therapist. There may be a copayment associated with it, and it is still very widely stigmatized. So having access to proper mental health treatment so that even the person who is committing harm is less likely to do so makes a big difference too. And that only happens when we are investing in a safe and an accessible healthcare system for everybody. All of those things are actual practical steps and things that we can do to make abolition real and to actually keep us safe from harm that we aren't doing now, or that we only do once the harm, providing a victim witness advocate or therapy sessions after a person has already committed the offense sometimes is a little counterproductive, because then they're already entangled with the injustice system. And like Alex said, once you're in that system, it becomes very, very difficult to become unentrapped with it.
I'm always hesitant. I talk on a lot of panels. I talk a lot about mental health courts. I talk a lot about community service or any sort of alternatives to incarceration. And I will always support alternatives to incarceration. If a district attorney wants to create a mental health court, I support that. But all of those systems are still inside of the larger umbrella of the criminal justice system. And one of the things that we're very uncomfortable with as Americans is just giving people money with no strings attached. And in particular, we really think poor people need to be taught lessons. We tie welfare to working, we tie disability with the ability to prove that you're disabled. And the truth is that the average person wants to work. The average person wants to do right by their kids. The average person does not want to be violent. And so we need to be comfortable with just giving money and not asking questions. And I also think it is an uncomfortable truth. People don't want to think it's just as easy as writing a check. They want to think these problems are just write the check and don't ask them how they're spending it. If someone wants to get some therapy, get some therapy. If someone wants to buy a pair of shoes, you know what? Shoes can actually be a form of mental health. And I just think we're so obsessed with making poor people regret every single dollar they spend and making them learn lessons and jump through hoops and be drug free. And sometimes you need drugs to actually get through the day. And we really don't like to sort of address that. And a lot of people are using drugs to deal with violence and trauma from their past, to self-medicate. And so we really just don't like to write the check, and we need to write the check. Sorry, that was a little rant. I feel strongly about writing the check. I apologize. I've calmed down.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. And while we're still talking about this idea of alternatives, especially ones that are housed outside of the criminal legal system, I wanted to know if either of you could maybe just share or plug some organizations or people that are doing that work. I know Ashley, you mentioned Miriam Kaba, but if there are other things that you kind of just have on top of your head, I think it would be great for people to know about.
Yeah, there are tons of organizations, and let me say that I do not support forced treatment. So I don't think drug courts and mental health courts are a good idea, because there's a significant imbalance of power there where you're forcing people to get treatment. And one of the main tenets of getting sober is that it has to be something that you do on your own, not because someone's threatening to send you to prison if you don't. And so here are a couple of organizations that are doing fantastic work. Survived and Punished. It's a national organization, but also has local chapters. Black and Pink, which is also another organization. And some of these are organizations in ways you can connect to people who have been harmed by the justice system, so that you can understand how to better advocate for changes in the justice system by listening to people who are impacted by it. The Ella Baker Center, the Community Justice Exchange, which has a great resource on how to, since we're talking about this in the scope and the guise of elections, and Alex has been talking about prosecutorial races and sheriff races, the Community Justice Exchange created this resource that can teach you about how to organize around prosecutorial elections. And it has all of these action steps, and it has these wonderful breakdown of things that you can do, things to look for, so that you understand how to go about organizing around prosecutors and DA elections. There's also court watch programs, Project NIA, the Transgender Law Center, a few resources, which I'm happy to leave if there's a chat. Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, which is a book. There's a new book called Prison by Any Other Name by Maya Shinwar and Victoria Law. And it talks about these things that we're talking about now. So what happens when social services gets involved? What happens when you make someone go to drug court and they weren't ready to get sober? All of these being extension of policing. And it breaks down what happens when we sort of turn these social services into carceral social services. Ghosts in the Schoolyard by Eve Ewing talks about what happens when we close schools and the public safety issues that arise when closing schools. And then last, Push Out by Monique Morris, since we've talked about police in schools. That specifically talks about the unfortunate and alarming trend of pushing Black girls out of school and into the justice system. And many of you may have become familiar with a case they had just this summer during virtual learning of a young Black girl who woke up late for class and didn't complete assignment on time and found herself in juvenile, her probation, revoked and in custody because she was behind in virtual school. And this is a student who had a known disability, whose teacher actually said, she wasn't that far behind all the other students, but this is a Black girl, and they found that it was not uncommon in Michigan. And so Monique Morris has a great book that talks about that and how we can push back against pushing our girls and our kids out of school and into the justice system. So those are a few things, and I'm happy to leave that information. I have it written down somewhere there's a chat. So I'm happy to leave those resources in the chat.
great resources. I would recommend the podcast Ear Hustle, which is from incarcerated people sharing their stories. And what I like about it in particular is it's easy to say that incarcerated people are people, but because they're behind closed doors and intentionally kept away from the public eye, you forget about that. And so what I love about listening to that podcast on a weekly basis is that we have so many people incarcerated in this country. And these are just regular people, their fathers, their mothers, uncles, cousins, neighbors, and they're being, taken out of their communities, and their futures are sort of being taken away from them. And their contributions to society are being suspended. I also really always like every single person to know about NAMI, which is the National Alliance for Mental Illness. NAMI is a national organization with local chapters, and they have support groups for people with mental illness. But what I like about NAMI is they have support groups for families of people that families who have family members with mental illnesses. And they're just a great resource to know about. And also, if anyone in your life ever experiences a mental health crisis, they're a great a local organization to call to ask what next steps to take. And then finally, my favorite Instagram follow, my favorite Twitter follow is Prison Policy Initiative, which is an organization that just spits out statistics about the mass incarceration problem in this country. It shows you that 600,000 people are booked into jail in America in a given year. It shows you stats about how the rate of women being incarcerated is up over 1,000% over the last 30 years. And just these scary statistics and these very shareable diagrams. And I love to share them with friends because every single one will stop you in your track and go, wow, this system is so big, it's so unfair, and it's just getting bigger and bigger every day. We need to fight against this.
One final resource I'll share, if you are someone who wants to actually get involved in your community and you're thinking about what can I do that's going to contribute to us not having to involve the police. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of mental health first aid, but it is a course that you can take almost like CPR, except for mental health. And they have courses both for youth and for adults. And what it does, it teaches you skills and gives you resources to know what to do to intervene if someone is in the midst of a mental health crisis or a substance use disorder crisis. And it allows us as community members to be able to intervene so that we don't need the presence of law enforcement. And you can act as an intermediary until they can get access to actual medical help. And the courses, depending on where you are, they can be free. So in Pennsylvania, they offer them for free. It's a one-day course. It's an awesome, awesome course that teaches you just some basic skills to look for to help in the event. We know that people who are experiencing mental health crises are 16 times more likely to be killed by the police. So if we as community members can recognize the signs of a crisis and be an intervention just until they can get access to like an EMT or to a doctor or to a psychiatrist, so that law enforcement doesn't have to get involved. That's one way in which we can make police obsolete.
Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing all those resources. We've been kind of throwing things into the chat, so if you wanted to copy and paste that, it'll be there. One thing that jumps out at me in this conversation has been like the importance of building community, building organizations, building capacity to like take care of ourselves outside of the criminal legal system, which is so much larger than I think a lot of people even conceive it to be. When we're talking about police reform and police reforms that kind of inadvertently give a lot of money to the police, what are just some things that folks should be thinking about? So when we're hearing about, body cameras or trainings or things that have been lifted up kind of time and time again and that we're kind of seeing again be put in the conversation, how should we be looking at those and thinking about those?
One of the things that I find so interesting is we never talk about like helping teachers in this way. And I know that's like an easy political argument, but teachers have been begging for help, and we never say like teachers just need more aides or they need more training or they need more days off. And so I'm very confused about why police officers get all of this help in their jobs. I am deeply sympathetic to police officers because I think what we did in this country is we destroyed the mental health system. And then we have made police officers be mental health workers on the front lines of a mental health crisis. And I do think they are not equipped for that. They were not asked to do that. They did not become police officers to be mental health care workers. But I also think we cannot turn police officers into mental health care workers. And so in the world that I imagine, where maybe there are a few police officers who investigate murders, that is all they do. And that is 5 guys sitting in a room waiting for a murder. But for every other function that the police officers serve, I want that to be taken away from police. I want that to be made into a much smaller department. So here in Atlanta, when you're driving around, when you see a car that's broken down by the side of the road, something called HERO is the force that's responding to that. It's not a police officer. So just anything, as you think about police officers, when you hear people say, well, we need social workers to become police officers to no. Don't get it involved with police. So I don't want any solution to be adding on to what police do or even giving police specialized training to do things. Instead, I want us to break away, because I hate to say this because this argument's not popular, but it's true. But have you been to the post office lately? Have you been to the DMV? People love to make fun of the government. The DMV does a fine job. Like, the post office does a great job. And so this weird animosity we have with the government, that the government doesn't do a great job. My life is full of friends and family members that work for the government. Most government employees are public servants that want to give back. But the police agency has become this huge militarized organization. It's giant, it's bloated, and we just need to break it the hell down. And by doing so, I think we can focus the missions of various organizations and really actually build something beautiful. I think there's gonna be a lot of experiments, a lot of ideas are gonna flourish and die. So I'm not against these ideas that are floating around, but I definitely think I don't like to fund the police because, again, it centers police. I want us to fund new ideas.
I'm sort of on the opposite spectrum of that, and that I think there is no redeeming quality to law enforcement at all in any situation. I think even their genesis, the fact that they even evolved from slave patrols and that anyone would participate in that, and that it just became more widely from slave patrols to labor disputes. So people who are like, I want my employees won't do what I say, so now I need you to force them to do this thing to hold them accountable. Like, the very genesis of who they are and what they are. And it's such a toxic and all-encompassing thing that even with the best intentions, the system in which and the way in which it functions, it does not allow for any type of goodness. That is just, it is antithetical to the idea of policing. And I think there are so many things, again, that we have given police to do that are not things that we need police. So if 2 people get in a car accident and the police respond, we don't necessarily need a police officer, and they have no specialized training that makes them more capable of deciding who is at fault. And heck, I don't know if any of you have ever been in a car accident and the police said one person was at fault, and then the insurance companies got involved and they made their own decision based on their adjusters and the reports and things of that nature. So they don't even have specialized skills that make them more suited to do some of the services that they engage in, whether that's be in schools, whether that's monitoring the halls of a hospital, whether that's responding to domestic violence situations, any of these things. So I think there are no redeeming qualities. And I'm someone who's had, personal experience. I've had police show up to my house at 2 a.m. to arrest my little brother on a warrant that was not valid. But for the fact that I knew to ask them to validate the warrant, my brother would have gone to jail. And how many people don't have that in their homes, And then what does that become? That becomes, a 2 or 3 day, if you're lucky, or a week or longer stay in jail where you're trying to figure out what's going on. I don't know how many of you've ever read a police report. so many of them are not even written well, that you can understand them. I've had police officers, as a prosecutor, actually copy and paste and literally only change the names. And I had to say, listen, I can tell you copy and pasted this because this isn't the right street for this case. And so there's so little training that happens, and so little, even with training, it's not required. We don't need them to mete out these disputes. There are ways we can put other things in place, like the hero unit is a good go-between. I love the State Farm hero units when they come, because they'll fix your flat for you too. They'll give you a jump if you need a jump if you're on the side of the road. They're awesome. And they won't take you to jail, or they won't accidentally shoot you and kill you because you had a flat tire on the side of the road. And so when we're looking at things like that, I don't think there are redeeming qualities in them. And I think there are certainly other systems and other mechanisms that we could use to meet those same needs that don't require policing.
Tamar, I think you had asked about like the proposals that are being put forth that we actually like. One of them is about accountability for bad cops. And I will say one of the things I've noticed is that there's this thing called POST, which is the entity that certifies police officers, and they do a pretty atrocious job monitoring reports against officers, and then also things that happen in the officer's personal life. So if like an officer's wife calls the police and says he hit me, but then she later withdraws the report. So I will say there's one reform that I've heard talked about, which is this idea of a more central repository for police complaints, citizens complaints against cops, in a way to really get bad police officers out of the system. And I do like that idea, and that probably is more money for police, but I do like that idea. So that's one sort of reform movement that I'm in favor of. But I will say, I think too often police themselves, and we definitely saw that in the Breonna Taylor case. So whenever I endorse a plan that polices police, I always wonder about the efficacy. But if the entity that watches police could be removed from the police organization itself, I would endorse something like that.
So I'm just checking the clock. We have about like 5 more minutes before Gabrielle comes back to wrap things up. This is a great conversation. I wanted to end with a question around the election, since this whole day has been focused on civic engagement and all the different dimensions of it. What should voters be looking for on the federal, state, and local level as, election season is coming up? And if you have time as well, I wanted to just get your thoughts on how our local electeds and federal elected officials are just missing the mark in terms of how they talk about and understand the complexities of police violence in America. So it's a 2-pronged question.
So I love that question, though, because so many people, I think voting is a tool that you can use in your toolbox. Mm-hmm. It is not even my favorite tool. It's the tool I'm the least excited about. And let me tell you why, because I grew up in DeKalb County, Georgia, which is Black. It is very Black. I was a prosecutor in DeKalb County, Georgia. All of our electeds are by and large Democrats. Our DAs are Black. Public defenders are Black. The sheriffs are Black. And these are Black Democrats. So by and large, these are supposed to be people who understand, or who come from the same ideals and beliefs that I have and that I share. And what I have learned by not missing a single election, my family has not missed a single election, that when you are operating within a violent system, it matters little that the people who are overseeing that system share your race, ethnicity, or your sexuality, any of those things. They do not matter, because the function of that system, in order to maintain power in that system, it has to play to white supremacy. And so even, again, people with the best intentions who, set out to join those offices or in those positions to make a difference, they quickly begin acting in ways that are anti-Black. And so for me, elections matter less, coming from someone who has lived in a county that has been largely run by Black Democrats who are, by all accounts, good people. And we still have in DeKalb County, Georgia, some of the highest rates of marijuana arrests in the entire state, not the county. It's the worst in the state. The treatment in the jail, both of my brothers have been incarcerated in that jail, is horrific. The prosecutors who are Black and progressives and their beliefs, that is a county where you had the DA prosecuting a drug dealer for murder for a person who overdosed. Murder for an overdose. So by and large, elections are less important. And what's more important to me when we think about how we get to a more just society, because that is a community that has routinely exercised its right to vote. And the recourse for them, unfortunately, has not been the property values have gone down in those Black areas. In the last 2 years, they have closed over 4 grocery stores in that area, in the Black areas. In the white areas, they have opened at least 4 new grocery stores, including a Whole Foods, a Sprouts, that has access to fresh and affordable vegetables and fruits. And they have closed down 4. They've closed at least 1 post office in the area, and the schools are routinely underfunded. And these are people who routinely vote, and they are civically engaged. But the function of the system is such that it plays to white supremacy, that the benefits have gone to the white parts of that county instead of its Black residents. So the action items that they can engage in is feeding the homeless and clothing the homeless. And you see that through the churches, through the civic organizations in that place. Supporting rioters via bail funds and who are working to say, we're not going to accept this system. We're not going to accept DeKalb County killing people like Anthony Hill and having no conviction. So supporting rioters through bail funds, eviction blockades. We know if you drive through Lithonia, Georgia, and see the number of houses that are boarded up, or through Decatur, Georgia, and see the number of houses that are boarded up. So it's supporting eviction blockades. Elders helping make sure that they can go, because there are so few grocery stores in the area now, making sure that you can take them to get access to good foods, helping them offset the cost of their medication where possible. And then mutual aid, where there is a need for helping to stand in the gap for parents with schooling and with jobs and with daycare. So those are some of the things. While I think elections are a great, it's a good thing to vote. And I understand, especially for Black people, what it took for us to get that right. I recognize that in some places that particular tool just does not chisel away at the problem hard enough. And so we've got to do more concrete things, like getting involved, like feeding our neighbors, making sure our neighbors can get the food that they need, making sure they can get their medicine. And that's the way we have to build community.
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing to add. I completely agree with everything that Ashley said, and she said it so beautifully. So I think that Audre Lorde said it best, that the master's tools will never destroy the master's house. And it is a broken system, and asking the system to be something that the system is not is never going to work. So, love your neighbors, vote, but also, tear down the system as it exists now. So, and encourage others to do the same and have these important conversations. These conversations are hard and awkward, but I have convinced so many people that the system does not work. And so please engage in these conversations.
Thank you all so much for joining our panel and our Black America Summit around civic engagement and a 2020 election. This has been honestly what I needed. All the conversations, what you were talking about, like, I'm from Decatur, where it's greater. I've been here in Detroit for a while, but like, these are conversations I've been having with people in my family, in my network. And it's just really important that we start having it outward with other people, and like just having the conversations and understanding and marking the changes that are happening in our communities and things that we've tried in the past and whatnot. And yeah, so anyways, this is obviously something we're going to keep talking about. I hope everybody follows our Black America Summit pages. We are creating a podcast so that we can continue the conversation throughout. And like, maybe it's not a full summit, but each week or twice a month, we could have someone come on and talk to us about these topics. So if you follow our Black America Summit page on Instagram, Facebook especially, and YouTube, you'll see us upload some of this content. So thank you again for joining, and please check us out for our future events and podcasts.
Thank you. Thank you for moderating. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ashley.
Yes, you're amazing. Thank you.